my first question is, what do you think are the biggest barriers to empowerment that women in rural areas in Latin America face today?
So I think the issues that rural women face are linked to those that all people in rural areas in Latin America face, which is the limited degree to which the state has capacity to provide services and enforce the laws that are actually on the books. So, in Nicaragua, I'm not sure, I don't know specifically like the laws about gender equality in Nicaragua, but in Latin America in general, constitutionally and legally, there's laws on the books that protect gender equality and women's rights in all kinds of ways. But there's limits in terms of the degree to which those laws are implemented and enforced. And that is so glaringly true in a place like Ciuna, where you can't, can you get there by road? Get there?
Uncertain.
I don't know. If there is, I suspect, that's why you fly, because there's not good roads that get there. And that is an illustration of low state capacity, right? So there, public health service, some sense of like people's understanding of their basic legal rights, state-mandated services, quality of education and public education. I mean, all of these things are lower generally in rural areas, and all of those things have direct implications for the status of women.
So would you say that there's, would the lack of state capacity in rural areas further create gender disparities, or is it a normalized gender disparity across urban and rural areas?
So rural women face distinctive issues from rural men, and they face distinctive issues with regard to women in urban areas. One place to look for this, by the way, is the CEDAW, the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Discrimination, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. I think it's Article 12 of CEDAW is all about rural women. And so it actually lays out what are the specific kind of global concerns of rural women. But also, so Nicaragua has ratified this treaty, and that obligates Nicaragua to file periodic reports about their compliance with that treaty, and they will have addressed specific issues about the status of rural women, specific to Nicaragua. So that's another resource for you. And that's not an area I've focused on, so those specific issues that are about rural women, I can only think about it generally in terms of we know that the more education that women have, lower birth rates, higher, all kinds of good things come from that, and we don't see that, and certainly in a place like Ciuna.
So going back to state capacity, what type of policies or lack of policies do you think are the most important, and within a Latin American context, that have inhibited this connection, which also causes gender barriers?
Well, I think about, so one example is domestic violence. So it's only within the last 20, maybe 30, no, really 20 years that most countries in Latin America have. That's not true. Chile had it in 1990s, so they had a law on the books. So that's relatively new. It's relatively recent that Latin American countries have laws penalizing domestic violence as a distinct crime. Previous to that, domestic violence was treated as a form of assault, and there was a presumption in the text of the laws in many cases, and certainly in the application. In the text of some laws about assault, if a man beat a woman, or if he even raped a woman, it would be okay. He wouldn't be held responsible if he married the victim. And that was in the text of laws, in the 20th century. So we're talking a very basic starting point. So now many countries have laws on the books that criminalize domestic violence. There's variation in terms of the quality of those laws, in terms of the kind of penalties that they apply, and the scope of what gets counted as domestic violence. There is wide variation in terms of how police enforce those laws, and that requires police officers to be trained in how to respond to domestic violence crimes. And then, let's say somebody gets convicted of domestic violence, the kind of alternatives to the status quo in rural areas are almost non-existent. So you don't have domestic violence shelters. There's no place that you can go.
Yeah.
They don't really have any alternatives. So all of those factors, plus a general kind of lack of education, feeds into this culture in which domestic violence is not really seen as a problem. And it's only recently. So now in Nicaragua is a little bit different, and I think it's the legacy of the Sandinistas and the Sandinistas' support for women's rights issues during the revolution and in the Sandinista government. That's complicated in the current Sandinista government, right? They're not a really strong women's rights government. But at the local level, there is some precedent for women leadership, women who played a role in the revolution, for example, who are local leaders who are tuned in to these issues. And so it may be that in specific areas you see some variation. You see, like, women's organizations that deal with domestic violence in ways that are effective, or at least intolerant of domestic violence, and you may see some changes. So that's definitely something to look for.
So during the Sandinista, original revolution in the 80s, I guess is what you're talking about, were there any, particular, policy, were there actual, legislative measures, or was it more, from, a cultural, open agreement perspective sort of side that, these measures for, women empowerment were imposed?
It actually predated the revolution. So it has to do with the percentage of women who were combatants in the Sandinistas, and then the women who rose to leadership positions, who held leadership positions in the initial Sandinista government. So that's part of it. But it's also that under the Sandinistas, they created an organization that promoted the rights of women. There are criticisms of it. It's a state-run organization. It represented the interests of the state, not necessarily women on the ground. But there was an official acknowledgement that women's rights was important, and that actually spawned some pressure and kind of created a space for pressuring for women's rights. So in Nicaragua, in a different way from other Central American countries, there was kind of a space and a precedent on an official level of acceptance for women's rights that you don't see elsewhere.
So, would you say that has had sufficient repercussions that today, where would Nicaragua place in contrast to other Latin American countries?
I mean, that's my sense. I don't know specifically about women's rights. That's my sense of, people say, well, why is, for example, gang violence right now, or just urban violence, homicide rates, why is Nicaragua's rate of homicide so much lower than it is in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras? I'd like to think it has something to do with the kind of the institutional legacies of the Sandinista government and the degree to which people kind of became empowered through participating in that revolution. As an untested hypothesis. I've seen it applied to other areas, and that's the argument that people make. That certain things were put in place just not in terms of in terms of institutions, but also in terms of people's mentality and how much kind of agency they claim as individuals. And
so my last question is in terms of maybe from a Latin American perspective, or Nicaragua, whichever you prefer, just what do you think is the best type of policy or governmental attitude that should be taken, that would ideally be taken in order to improve the condition of women in rural areas?
I don't think there's one. I think there's many, many, many. And that's what we're seeing in Latin America now, is that on every single front, education, violence against women, reproductive rights, women in political leadership, women in the political parties, on every single one of those fronts, there's action at the level of local grassroots, at the level of NGOs, at the level of government. There's things taking place, and I, at this point, I might have things that I'm particularly interested in, but I don't think there's a panacea to it. I think one thing that characterizes the status of women's rights issues in Latin America is precisely because of this treaty. Governments signed this treaty. Every Latin American government is a party to this Convention on Women's Rights. They signed it at a time when nobody really thought it was going to make much of a difference. But in part because of the changes in how people think about human rights and how they think about international agreements, activists on the ground can now use those treaties to call their own governments to account and say, you signed this declaration that says you will provide the following things, and you haven't done that. So there's an aspect of kind of shaming and calling to account. In some cases, they have used international tribunals to file suit in cases of gender not complying with gender quota laws, in terms of inadequate protections for women in cases of domestic violence. They have used the Inter-American Court of Human Rights to press charges against domestic governments for failure to have relief in certain cases.
So would you say, do you think there's a correlation between, like, sort of like, in a sense, all of these things about, like, gender, like, women's rights, and a lot of the things in this treaty are, like, only now being very, like, widely sort of, like, applied, whether by governments or by NGOs. And, like, there's a big NGO presence in Latin America in general.
Yeah.
So do you think, in a way, that this is influenced mostly because of, like, why do you think this was not so sort of like strongly applied before, like when it was first signed? And do you think that the sort of like whether there's any correlation between what is currently occurring and increasing globalization, or whether how political systems within Latin America are changing?
It's all of those things. It's all of those things. It's the NGOs on the ground and kind of being increasingly, and Latin America, in Latin American countries, women's organizations are incredibly well networked, in part because of their mobilization in the context of human rights violations and revolutionary struggle, and all the different political events that have occurred. The human rights regime has become more powerful over time. As a result of, that's a really difficult story to tell. It's like a lot of different components, and there are a lot of books I could give you to read that talk about how that transition occurred. But one way to think about it is, I think about it in terms of people began to be aware that their governments had signed these treaties, and not just the women's rights, but Convention Against Torture, Convention against Genocide. People began realizing this, and they were organizing and saying, you signed this, so we're not asking for anything revolutionary here, we're simply asking for you to hew to your agreements. And that has, and then why that has hit is all kinds of explanations for that. But what I want to say with this is that this mechanism of using treaties to generate pressure on domestic governments, that's one thing that is, I think, similar across all kinds of issue areas. Violence against women, education, rural issues, politics. You see this kind of dynamic. It's called the boomerang effect.
But so going on from that, do you think that, like, within this boomerang effect, like, are there any particular controversies to the role of that NGOs are playing in promoting these? Like, is there anything that you could find as, like, controversial or problematic about the role that NGOs are taking in, like, local?
Absolutely. Right. So, think about it. Think about an NGO, and in Peru. Okay. And think about an NGO that has the capacity to get themselves to New York to testify in front of the committee that oversees this treaty. They're going to speak English. They're going to have access to resources. They're going to have funding. They're going to know what the issues are. They're going to know that it exists. That's a very high level of sophistication, right? So, and they're probably going to have connections with, international women's organizations, international human rights organizations. And one could argue that, that means they are more geared outward. They're geared toward what's going to sustain themselves as an organization, rather than to, what's happening with poor women in Ciuna. And so poor women in Ciuna, they're the ones who really need the kind of infrastructure and the support that an NGO like that could provide, but it might be the case that NGO is spending a lot of time in Geneva, right? And so the issue is called, the phenomenon is called NGOization. Like, the women's movement becomes divided between those who think we need to work on the ground and we need to work on, like, the professionalization, the development of... And really, you need all those things, right? You need them all going all at once. But when you have such limited resources, the trade-offs are really acute.
Great. Okay, and last question, which isn't really as related, but do you think that what do you think has been the influence of revolutionary movements across South America Latin America in the latter, like late 20th century? Like, what has been the impact of those on the role, on the status of women today?
I think it's where feminism came from.
Yeah.
Because in those revolutionary movements, there was no consciousness about gender. It was all about class. And it was all about, el pueblo, and the people are all together. And it didn't matter if you're compañero, everyone's together in the struggle, and there's equality within the struggle. And so that's why you see so many women combatants in Nicaragua, El Salvador, the Montoneros. But what happened is that, let's say you're in a revolutionary cell, and you're kind of operating clandestinely underground. The leader's always going to be a man. You might get pregnant. Your compañeros are sleeping around. Like, gender politics is happening all around you, and the rhetoric of liberation and equality and freedom is very much at odds with the lived experience of what the revolution is like.
Mm-hmm.
And that experience prompted that with, the disaster, the violent outcome of so many revolutionary movements that, it proved to be a very naive, in a lot of cases, a very naive strategy and they did not anticipate how violent the response was going to be. And, I'm not talking about Sendero, because Sendero is otra cosa. It's its own thing in terms of gender relations.
Yeah.
I still don't understand it.
Oh, they're fascinating.
But that conflict and thinking men led us wrong, men led us down the path of violence.
Mm-hmm.
Those things together were like this cauldron in which women began to have this feminist awakening. And you read, memoirs of guerrillas, and you read about women who became leaders in the feminist movement, and the early leaders, they all have this is their story. And it's consistent throughout the whole region. And it's not dissimilar to what happened in the United States, except it wasn't necessarily armed revolutionary, it was civil rights and the anti-war movement, where it's we're all together, right? And yeah, but you're making the coffee.